Hello, and welcome back to the channel. I am your host and friendly neighborhood blue mage, Azarain. I'm loving all the comments and new subscribers that I'm seeing here on YouTube, so thank all of you. I'm really trying to make the push to become a YouTube partner, so if you like the content I'm creating and want to see more of it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Anyway, it's enough of that. Thank you again, and let's get into today's video. There are many ways to play Commander, and your Commander is obviously the most important part. Your Commander will determine everything about your deck, what the deck wants to do at its core, all the way down to the color of sleeves that you buy. There are solid 2-color pairings that give you a wide array of cards in enemy and allied pairings. The allied pairings are the colors that are next to one another on the color wheel, and the enemy pairings are the ones across from each other. Allied pairings usually handle problems and get answers in similar ways, whereas enemy pairings usually excel at one thing and struggle with others. Then you can move on to the 3-color pairings, with excellent access to a lot of powerful lands and expensive mana bases, or the even more in-depth 4-color Nephilim pairings that get even more complicated. But at the root of all the different color pairings, there is the base color identities of the single colors. In today's video, I want to tell you about why you should play a monocolored deck. And we're going to start off with the best color there is, mono blue. You can make an argument for your favorite color pairings of 2, 3, or even 4 colors. But in my opinion, you have not experienced the true nature of a color until you've played it by itself. You will get to see what that color excels at and what it struggles with. I've had some of the most fun times in Commander when playing a monocolored deck, as they challenge me as a deck builder to work around certain problems that color has while leaning into its strengths. Before I go too far off into a tangent, I just want to get into the topic and show you what I mean with the color that we're diving into. Get it? Dive, like dive into the water. Okay, forget it. Moving on. Blue. You know it, you love it, you probably hate it for some reason or another. Blue is often viewed as every other color's annoying little brother. Blue is meant to sit in the background, draw you cards, protect your stuff, and counter the scary spells. I'm here to tell you that blue is so much more than just card draw or control, even though that's what the color excels at. Blue is the color of wisdom and control, and when paired with something else, it usually takes a back seat. Blue is symbolized by a water droplet, so usually deals with water and the ocean. This lends us to some of Blue's most popular creature types, such as Merfolk, being Blue's defined creature type, that it also shares with green since Ixalan, sea creatures like Leviathans, Krakens, Octopus, Serpents, that it also shares with black, Giants, which it shares with red, and Sphinxes, which are personally my favorite creature type. Usually are contained within mono blue, blue white, and the Esper colors. Blue is also adept in areas such as Spellslinger and artifacts. When blue is forced to stand on its own, we take away certain things like ramp, kill or exile spells, ways to deal with enchantments or artifacts, and board wipes. So today I'm going to try and go over everything I've learned about how to hit these areas that blue struggles with when it stands alone. Section 1. Ramp. Ramp is probably the most important aspect of EDH because this is what propels us ahead and allows us to play the game. Blue is terrible at getting extra lands out or having mana dorks, but here are some of the ways that blue can get ahead on mana. We're going to start off with the artifacts. Here's where I'm going to recommend that you play any colored mana producer that you want, but I also want to showcase the artifacts that cost blue so you can play them in your mono blue deck. The first card we're going to talk about is Moonsnare Prototype. So for 1 mana, we get a blue artifact that says tap the Moonsnare Prototype, also tap an untapped artifact or creature you control, and we add a colorless mana. Now obviously this is a little funky and weird. It's a single mana, it needs to tap itself and tap something else, and it provides us with a colorless, but I included it on this list because blue will excel at either making tokens or just having a bunch of standalone artifacts, and hopefully the Moonsnare Prototype will then act as a mana dork. The Moonsnare Prototype can come in at 1 mana and it can immediately tap as it's an artifact. It doesn't have summoning sickness. The next spell I want to talk about is the Lapis Orb of Dragonkind. Now this definitely seems like a dragon payoff, but just hear me out. It's 3 mana, so it's just like our Commander Spheres. It's 2 and a blue, and it taps to add 1 blue mana. When you spend this mana to cast a dragon creature spell, scry 2. So this has some dragon payoffs. Possibly you're playing some big blue dragons in your deck. But honestly, in a mono blue deck, this is basically just Commander Sphere without drawing a card. Lapis Orb of Dragonkind, if we truly need it in our mono blue decks, this is a 3-mana rock that taps for blue. Usually in the 2-mana rock spot, they're either going to tap for a color or they're going to tap for colorless. And sometimes decks really want colored mana. So I included it here so that way you can see a blue artifact that taps for blue. Next, we're going to talk about the Midnight Clock. So again, in that 3-mana spot, it's 3-mana artifact that taps for blue that also has pay 3 mana, 2 and a blue, just like its casting cost, and you put an hour counter on Midnight Clock. At the beginning of each upkeep, put an hour counter on Midnight Clock. When the 12th hour counter is put on Midnight Clock, shuffle your hand and your graveyard into your library, then draw 7 cards. Exile Midnight Clock. Again, a super kind of clunky or weird card that just will sit out on the battlefield. It will tap for mana for us. And when it comes time, it's going to get rid of itself. It's going to replenish our hand. It's going to replenish our graveyard back into our deck. And it's just going to shuffle up. Maybe it's late game. Maybe we need some extra cards in our hand. This basically just says, here's a fresh pile of 7. Don't worry about your graveyard. You got all your good spells back in your deck. Keep playing. Next, I wanted to highlight Sky Diamond and Silvermere. So these two are the more clunkier mana dorks in mono blue. Sky Diamond is that 2-mana rock that I always talk about, but Sky Diamond has the issue where it enters tapped. These mana rocks are obviously not very well liked in the Commander community, but when we're playing mono blue, we're honestly going to need all the help we can get. Silvermere is also a mana dork that comes down for 2 mana. Not as good as obviously the mono green mana dorks are, which come in for 1 mana, but again, Silvermere, it's one of our only mana dorks. It's going to have summoning sickness, so we're not going to be able to tap it right away as it is a creature, but still, I want to talk about it. I don't think these are awful cards. When you're playing decks that struggle with ramp, need something, even if it comes at a downside of entering tapped or not being able to tap right away. When you untap with it, when you are able to tap them, it's going to act like any other rock, and trust me, you'll be happy to have the extra mana. Next up, I wanted to talk about the only thing that I found in mono blue that actually ramps you on lands. Dreamscape Artist. It's 2 mana for a 1/1 human Spell Shaper. I'm not sure how many other Spell Shaper creature types there are. We pay 3 mana and tap the Dreamscape Artist. Then we discard a card, sacrifice a land, and we search our library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them into play. Shuffle your library. Now this all just seems so complicated, and there's so many downsides on Dreamscape Artist. He comes in, he can't tap right away, he's a 1/1, so he's no good at blocking. It's 3 mana and tap him, we lose a card in our hand, and we sacrifice a land. It just seems awful to do all of those things. We do get to search our library for 2 lands, and they do enter the battlefield untapped. So we need the mana to play into Dreamscape Artist, that 3 mana, but we get 2 mana in return. So it's technically like the Dreamscape Artist was just a single mana and tap him. Losing the card in your hand is pretty bad, but we're playing mono blue. So hopefully we'll be able to draw a bunch of cards, we'll discard something that we don't need, and we'll get to go up on lands. Next up is our true mana dork section. The first one I want to talk about is Apprentice Wizard. For 3 mana, 1 blue, we get a 0/1 human wizard. All it says on it is pay 1 blue and tap the Apprentice Wizard, and you get 3 colorless mana. Usually blue is really restrictive, that will say only use this mana to spend on instant sorcery spells, only use this mana on artifact spells or abilities. Apprentice Wizard, it's going to tap for the same amount of mana that we can play him for, 3. It is colorless, but in mono blue, we're either going to play artifacts, big X spells, or just creatures with a lot of colorless converted mana cost over on the side. Apprentice Wizard is going to help us hit those. Yes, it comes down for 3 and only taps for 3, but when it comes back around to our turn, we pay 1 blue to get 3 colorless, so we go up 2 mana. We're excelling on mana. It's going to be included in on this list, even if it's clunky. Next up is the Deranged Assistant. For 2 mana, 1 and a blue, we get a 1/1 human wizard again. All it says on it is tap the Deranged Assistant, we mill a card, and we add a colorless mana. Obviously, you can kind of see a theme here where we have a downside to then get a different upside in mono blue. So the Deranged Assistant, we don't need to pay mana into to tap him, but we do need to mill a card. Now, in mono blue, we can add in things that are either going to shuffle our graveyard back into our library so we can make sure not to lose anything that we really needed, or we can include things that allow us to cast things from our graveyard, such as Emery that will allow us to cast artifacts, or spells with flashback. So if we lose something, it's not gone forever. We can make sure to utilize our graveyard, and Deranged Assistant will also give us a colorless mana to spend on other things. Next is Sea Scryer. For 1 and a blue, we get a 1/1 Merfolk. You tap the Sea Scryer, add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool, play this ability as a mana source, which means that you can just play it to add mana to your mana pool. Then we can also pay 1 colorless, tap the Sea Scryer, and we add a blue to our mana pool. Play this ability as a mana source, so it's just the same thing. So we can either use the Sea Scryer to go up 1 colorless mana, or we can use the Sea Scryer as a filter. So if we have an artifact or something that creates colorless, we can then filter that into the Sea Scryer to create a blue that we might need. And lastly, it is the king of I'm gonna make all the blue mana. It's your favorite, Urza, Lord High Artificer. So for 4 mana, 2 blue, we get a 1/4 human artificer that brings a buddy with him. He brings down that Construct, which is a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. So he basically brings a mana dork with him. And Urza's awesome because he says tap an untapped artifact, add blue. That gets around Summoning Sickness. So we just created a bunch of artifact creature tokens. Urza can then tap them immediately and give us blue mana. He's got another upside where we pay 5 colorless into him, we shuffle our library, exile the top card, and until end of turn, we may cast that without paying its mana cost. Urza is the complete package. He's an insanely powerful card. I'm sure that everybody watching right now knows the power of this guy. Blue wants to be playing a lot of artifacts anyway. As I mentioned earlier, that's just an area that blue excels in. So Urza, even without a bunch of other artifacts out, he will make a creature that he can immediately tap for mana. He is 4 mana, so he's a bit of a mid-game investment, but still, once you untap with this guy, you'll have loads of mana. Next, we're going to talk about untappers. Things that will untap your mana or your mana rocks. First, we're going to start off with Teferi Temporal Archmage. So for 4 blue, 6 in total, we get a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Teferi has 3 abilities. So +1, we look at the top 2 cards of our library, 1 in our graveyard, 1 at the bottom, so he draws us a card. -1, untap up to 4 target permanents. So this can be creatures if we attacked, this can be just straight up lands, or usually how Teferi is used is that you untap your mana rocks. So you untap those Thran Dynamos, Gilded Lotus, whatnot, so you can play into a big creature or a big X spell. I'm not even going to read Teferi's last ability because that's not really what I'm talking about. Teferi can also be our commander if that's the route that you wish to go. Next, I'm going to talk about things that enter the battlefield and untap some lands. First is going to be a card that you might be well aware of, Peregrine Drake. Peregrine Drake is a 5 mana, 4 and a blue for a 2/3 flyer. When Peregrine Drake comes into play, untap up to 5 lands. Now usually Peregrine Drake is used in combination with Deadeye Navigator, for the combo being Deadeye Navigator is 2 mana, you flicker Peregrine Drake, he comes in, he untaps 5 lands, you use 2 of that mana to flicker the Peregrine Drake, and you now can repeat that loop an infinite amount of times, and you just created infinite mana. I'm not going to talk about that combo per se, but I'm just going to mention Peregrine Drake because if you can make your creatures cheaper, or if you choose to go in a combo route, this will allow you to get a creature and untap your lands. Next, the same effect is going to be the Great Whale, which does just the same thing, except it's 7 mana, so 5 blue for a 5/5 whale that untaps the lands. And the next is Palancron. So again, for 7, 5 blue. When Palancron comes into play, untap up to 7 lands, so it's technically free when you cast it. And then you can pay 4 mana to return Palancron to its owner's hand. So again, it's just that loop, just the same as Peregrine Drake and the Deadeye Navigator. You return it to your hand, you untap 7 lands, you cast it, blah, blah, blah. You get where I'm going. And the last one is Treachery. Treachery is a 5 mana enchantment, 3 blue. When Treachery comes into play, untap up to 5 lands. You control enchanted creature. So Treachery is really powerful. You need to have the 5 mana to cast it, obviously. You cast it, you take control of something on the board, you get a really strong creature from one of your opponents, and you get to untap 5 lands. So it's technically free. There are definitely a lot more things in mono blue that will tap for mana, but I left them out as they're restrictive by only allowing you to cast artifacts with the mana or cast instants or sorceries with the mana. So I made sure to leave those out, and if you want to dig for those, you certainly can. But in today's video, I'm just going to focus on the things that get us ahead on mana somehow. The last area that I want to talk about are spells that give you extra mana. So we're going to start off with High Tide. For 1 mana, it says, whenever an island is tapped for mana this turn, its controller adds an additional blue. High Tide is very powerful, obviously, because our deck being in mono blue, we are going to make sure to take more advantage of High Tide than anyone else. High Tide also does give our opponents the ability to tap for extra mana, but hopefully they're not going to be utilizing their mana like we are. High Tide will come down very cheaply at 1 mana and allow us to just get right into the late game. Like, let's say if we had 4 lands out, we cast High Tide with one of our lands, we have 3 lands left, we have access to 6 mana. High Tide is great, it would get out some big late game spells much earlier. Next up we have Mana Drain. So for blue, we counter a spell, and then during our upkeep, we add colorless mana equal to that spell's converted mana cost. You know Mana Drain, you love Mana Drain, I don't really need to waste a bunch of time talking about it. It's a way to get a threat off of the board and give us mana for our next turn. And last up is Spell Swindle, one of my personal favorites. So for 5 mana, 3 blue, it's an expensive card. For 5 mana, you counter a spell, it works just like Mana Drain. You counter it, but instead of getting mana, colorless mana, we're going to make that many treasure tokens. So if we have a way like Gazaleth Prismari or Urza, like I mentioned earlier, we can then tap those treasure tokens without sacrificing them to gain mana from them, or we can just sacrifice them whenever we want to. Mana Drain, you kind of have to use that colorless mana and then it goes away. Spell Swindle will keep those treasures around so we can keep them for as long as we want. As you can see, the land mana ramp section of blue is very weird, but it can be effective. Mono Blue's downside is actually something that has helped me stay alive longer in 4-player games. Yes, blue is the big bad boogeyman of Magic because counter spells, but when you're playing Mono Blue, you're less of a threat because of the workaround that you have to do in some areas. There have been countless times where my opponents seem to leave me alone because I'm in, quote, last place due to my insufficient ramp, which has allowed me to make it to the late game and get to where I want to be with Mono Blue. Able to control some gassed out opponents who have spent the early and mid game using their creatures and spells on each other. Now, there will be the question of why don't the other 3 players just kill you outright because you could be a threat later in the game if they do nothing about you. This is where you'll have to brush up on my earlier videos, how to play casual control and commander. Deals and politics will help you stay alive. Maybe don't counter every spell and make an offer to protect someone or their permanents for something in return, like not killing you. Believe it or not, blue actually has some solid removal options. Blue is usually known for returning things to its owner's hand. For some reason, Wizards of the Coast has been giving blue kill spells and exile creature spells, but definitely for a cost. You will always have to give your opponent something in return for taking out their creatures. We're going to start off with the exile section. The first spell we're going to talk about is Resculpt. So for 2 mana, 1 and a blue, we can exile a target artifact or creature. So this hits 2 things on 2 fronts, but we give the opponent a 4/4. Now, I'm not exactly sure how much I'm in favor of giving my opponent a big creature that they can use to block or even attack me if it comes down to it, but hitting both an artifact or a creature gives us some really nice utility options with Resculpt. The next is Raven Form, which does something very similar to Resculpt, except it's 3 mana at sorcery speed. But Raven Form can be foretelled, so that's paying 2 colorless mana. We set Raven Form off to the side face down so no one can see it except us, and then we can cast it for its foretell cost of mono blue. Raven Form will get rid of a creature or an artifact, and it gives our opponent a 1/1 bird, which is much better than the 4/4 that Resculpt gives. Next is one of my personal favorites of Reality Shift. 2 mana, exile target creature. Exile being such a great effect, getting around things like Indestructible. But we get rid of a creature. The creature that we got rid of, the opponent flips the top card of their library face down, and that card becomes a 2/2. Now, if that card is a creature card, the controller may flip it face up at any time for paying its mana cost. So it's kind of like giving it flash if it's a creature, but if we hit an instant or sorcery, an enchantment, a land, anything like that, it stays that 2/2. So it's almost like you're exiling 2 things, their creature and the top card of their library. And lastly is Curse of the Swine. So for X blue, it says exile X target creatures, and then for every creature we exile, its controller then makes a 2/2 blue boar. Curse of the Swine is great for decks that want to either make a lot of mana or discount their instants and sorceries. Curse of the Swine is kind of like a board wipe, but I didn't include it in the board wipe section because we have to pay mana for however many creatures we're getting rid of. So it's technically like target removal, whereas board wipe, you pay a flat cost and it gets rid of everything. Next up is the destroy section. This is going to be rapid hybridization and Pongify, which essentially they both do the same thing. So at instant speed, we got 1 blue mana, rapid hybridization gives a 3/3 frog lizard, and Pongify gives a 3/3/8. I don't need to say much more. These cards destroy creatures, and they give the 3/3s. They're pretty classic in blue, and you probably know them and have played them in the past. Moving on to our next section is board wipes. Now in the true mono blue fashion, there's not going to be a whole lot of true board wipes, but a lot of things that return mass amount of permanents to their owner's hands. And first off, I'm going to talk about the card that you already know and love, Cyclonic Rift. So for 2 mana, 1 and a blue, we get an instant, we can return a non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, and we can pay Overload 6 and a blue, so 7 in total, and we replace target with all, so return all non-land permanents you don't control to its owner's hand. Sea Rift is a classic mono blue finisher, I don't need to say much more about it. Next up, we're going to talk about probably one of the most true board wipes in mono blue, the Phasing of Zhalfir. The Phasing of Zhalfir is 4 mana, so just like those Damnations or Wrath of God, but it's an enchantment saga with read ahead, so we can choose to skip ahead chapters from 1, 2, and 3 to get these effects. Both chapters 1 and 2 of Phasing of Zhalfir say, another target non-land permanent phases out. It can't phase in for as long as you control the Phasing of Zhalfir. So this is going to be used on stuff we control to phase it out, and then when we hit the 3rd chapter of the Phasing of Zhalfir, we destroy all creatures. For each creature destroyed this way, its controller creates a 2/2 black Phyrexian creature token. Then, when the Phasing of Zhalfir leaves, the stuff that we chose to phase out will phase back in. It's clunky, it's slow. If we're going to get that full effect, it's going to take 3 turns, but we get the chance to save something that we control, destroy the rest, or we can just read ahead, we destroy everything, everyone gets a bunch of 2/2s. It's going to get rid of the scary stuff, it's going to leave a board state behind, but again, it's mono blue, it's got to give something in return. It's not going to be like white or black that just says destroy or exile all, but in my opinion, the Phasing of Zhalfir is akin to a Damnation or a Wrath of God. Next, we're going to talk about Evacuation, which is honestly one of my favorite board wipes in mono blue. Evacuation is kind of expensive as it's 5 mana, so 3 blue at instant speed, which I think makes up for the mana cost. It just says, return all creatures to their owner's hands. This allows us to protect our stuff if we need it. This gets rid of a wide board that someone may have been working on the entire game, returns those pesky mana dorks, and especially if somebody is playing tokens, you're going to get rid of all the tokens. They just go into the Aether, they don't go to someone's hand, obviously, they cease to exist. So in a way, Evacuation is like a board wipe. Next, I want to talk about Displacement Wave. Now, Displacement Wave is interesting as it's X blue at sorcery speed. Return all non-land permanents with converted mana cost X or less to their owner's hands. So this is like a weaker Cyclonic Rift as we're going to have to pay more mana into X, but usually things are not going to exceed 6. So if we pay 4, 5, or 6 mana, it's going to return all non-land permanents, not just creatures, which is why I included it on this list, to their owner's hands. It will hit our own stuff, but in many ways that's going to be okay because when we cast this, hopefully we're going to be setting everyone else much farther back than just us. Next, I want to talk about Scourge of the Fleets. So for 7 mana, this effect is stapled onto a 6/6 Kraken. When Scourge of the Fleets enters the battlefield, return each creature your opponents control, so not affecting us, with toughness X or less, where X is the number of islands we control. Now we're playing in mono blue, so we don't have to worry about if we have a certain amount of mana in another color, other lands. If we're playing 3 or 4 colors, we're only going to be in blue, so obviously we're going to have a lot of islands. Scourge of the Fleets does only hit creatures, but it is creatures that our opponents control, so it makes sure to save us, and it's a 6/6 body for 7 mana that has an additional effect, which is why I included it here. Next up is Devastation Tide. So for 5 mana at sorcery speed, return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. But it can also be miracled for 2 mana. So you may cast this card for its miracle cost when you draw it if it's the first card you drew this turn. I included this card on this list because sometimes we just need that cheap effect. It's 5 mana, it returns all non-land permanents, so such as Devastation Tide, where we're going to have to pay mana to get everything gone. This is just a solid 5 mana when we need it in a pinch if we're about to lose the game, or we can miracle it out for 2 mana, we return everything. So we just kind of reset the game clock and then start to rebuild. And lastly, there's Crush of Tentacles. So for 6 mana, it's 4 blue at sorcery speed. Return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. If Crush of Tentacles' surge cost was paid, put an 8/8 blue octopus creature token onto the battlefield. So Surge says you may cast the spell for its surge cost if you or a teammate casted another spell this turn. The Surge is 5 mana, so 3 blue. I put Crush of Tentacles on. I just love the artwork. It's at Mythic. It's just a cool looking card, and it has the chance of giving you an 8/8 while everyone else is going to be in their rebuilding phase. If you double spell, it's cheaper, only by 1 mana, but it does give you an 8/8, which is nothing to shy away from. And lastly, I want to round out our removal section by talking about 2 other cards that I love to use by great effect. First is going to be Imprisoned in the Moon. So for 3 mana, we get an enchantment that enchant creature, land, or planeswalker. Enchanted permanent is a colorless land with tap and add a colorless, and it loses all other card types and abilities. Imprisoned in the Moon has been amazing in my mono blue decks. It is limited as it only hits creatures, lands, or planeswalkers, but you would be surprised how important getting rid of a pesky land like a Valakut or hitting a planeswalker that you don't have to actually attack. You can just get around someone's blockers, enchant it. It does, again, we're in mono blue, so it gives that upside. So it's going to give them 1 colorless mana, but I would way rather have someone tap a planeswalker for a colorless mana than get access to all its abilities. And lastly on this list, we're going to talk about Capsize. So for 1 blue, we can return a target permanent to its owner's hand. Then it has a buyback of 3 colorless mana. So as the spell resolves, if we pay the buyback cost, as it resolves, we get to put it into our hand. So if we have either a lot of mana, like with a High Tide, or if you want to go the infinite route, Capsize can be used to return all permanents to their owner's hands. Obviously, you're not going to choose yourself, but you're basically just going to Cyclonic Rift even the lands back to your opponent's hands, and then you're going to win the game from there. As you can see, Mono Blue has some issues taking care of spells once they've made it past our counter spells. But where Mono Blue does well is that it can handle most anything with spells that say target permanent, where colors like green or red usually hit a certain type. Yes, we might not be able to destroy a lot, but returning to their owner's hands is almost just as good. To round out this video, playing Mono Blue might seem intimidating at first. You're playing in arguably the slowest color in Magic, you are adept at playing control, and others might not like that. Your creature selections are not the best and usually come down late game, and you have little to no access to reliable ramp. But you do have access to card draw. You will always have an answer to everything. You can make sure to keep yourself alive in the early and mid game and actually make it to your big spells and creatures late game. And you have tons of artifact synergy to rely on to create a backbone for your deck. In conclusion, Mono Blue has its shortcomings, as every color does. I hope that today's video has changed your mind about the aspects of Mono Blue. Blue does not always have to be the color of permission, and it can be more than just a complementary color that sits in the background. I hope that you consider playing Mono Blue. Now to go over my Mono Blue deck and some other commanders that offer a different side of blue other than pure headache-inducing control. My personal Mono Blue deck is Unesh, Cryosphinx Sovereign. Unesh is 6 mana, I know, huge in Mono Blue. He's a Sphinx, he's only 4/4, he has flying, and makes your other Sphinxes cost 2 generic less to cast. Also, when he or another Sphinx enters, you must reveal the top 4 cards, and an opponent puts them into 2 piles. You put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard. I made sure to include that wording because Unesh does not say you may. Unesh just says when he or another Sphinx enters, you do this. You do not get the choice. Sphinx was the first creature type that I really fell in love with in Magic. Unesh is expensive, but he makes all your other Sphinxes cheaper, as the creature type in general is about 6 mana to cast. Plus, when your Sphinxes enter, you get to draw cards. Unesh gives you access to a flying army and card draw. You want to make sure to pack your deck with early game control, counterspells, and plenty of mana rocks to make sure that you can cast Unesh earlier than turn 6. And then you want to just start rolling in the value until you can start smashing your opponents in the air with your flying army. Or, just deck yourself and play Labman, Jace, or Thoracle. But hey, you do you. Next up is going to be Octavia, Living Thesis. Octavia is an 8/8 octopus for 10 mana. And you heard me right, 10. Octavia also costs 8 less if you have 8 or more instants and sorceries in your graveyard. She also has Ward 8 and Magecraft, so whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, Target creature gets power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. Well, that is a lot of 8s in there. Octavia is the definition of a mono blue spellslinger. You want to include your control suite and then a bunch of cheap, cantripping payoffs to make sure you can cast your 8/8 bomb for 2 mana, then put in token creators like Talrand and Murmuring Mystic and the like to get some small boys out to turn them into 8/8s and swing out. Next up is God Eternal Kefnet. God Eternal Kefnet is a 4/5 zombie god with flying and is super hard to get rid of. When God Eternal Kefnet dies or is put into exile, you can put it third from the top of your library so you can get around paying that commander tax. You may reveal the first card you draw on each turn as you draw it. Whenever you reveal an instant or sorcery, copy that card. You may cast the copy. The copy costs 2 generic less to cast. God Eternal Kefnet wants you to play big spells, and then he will allow you to cast a copy for cheap and hold the real version in your hand to cast later. Getting 2 copies of a powerful spell seems pretty broken in Commander to me. You will want to include your Spellslinger payoffs and make sure that you're drawing cards on everyone else's turn, as it says the first one you draw on each turn. Then make sure you're playing mostly at instant speed to get the most use out of God Eternal Kefnet as possible. And lastly, we're going to talk about Min, Wily Illusionist. Min is a 1/3 gnome wizard that says, whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 1/1 illusion that gets +1/+0 for each other illusion you control. Whenever an illusion you control dies, you may put a permanent with mana value less than or equal to that creature's power from your hand onto the battlefield. Min obviously wants you to draw cards to make her illusions, but she doesn't just trigger off of the illusions that she creates. You will want to be playing a sort of illusion tribal deck to make sure that you can get the most out of her ability as possible, instead of just relying on drawing 2 cards every turn and then making an illusion. After you get your card draw and your illusion creatures figured out, the last step is to make sure that you include colorless sacrifice outlets such as Ashnod's Altar or Altar of Dementia to get your illusion payoff whenever you want. Then lastly, you also need to include the big spells that you're going to be playing for free. And if all else fails, Min will make your illusions huge, with the illusions she creates getting that power buff. I think that does it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed, and please make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment on your favorite mono blue commander. I hope you've changed your mind and I've gotten you to start brewing on how to play mono blue. Thanks for watching.